In 1916, Vladimir Lenin, the famous socialist leader, wrote a book entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In that book, Lenin explained that in capitalist systems, companies grow and grow until they become monstrous monopolies. Monopolies capable of dominating markets, subjugating entire countries, dominating rulers, and, in short, taking control over the whole of society. According to Lenin's perspective, capitalism and its monopolies are a real curse, a disease for humanity, something that should be avoided at all costs. And that is why, just 1 year after the publication of his book, he became the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution and started the first great socialist experiment in history, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The truth is that Lenin's theory was not actually new. Back in the 19th century, Karl Marx and other economists far removed from communism and socialism, such as Alfred Marshall, argued that capitalism was a system that led to corporate concentration. If these theories were true, in the future we would live in a scenario dominated by large monopolies that could condemn us all to poverty and inequality. The question is there really evidence that this is going to happen? Does capitalism really foster the concentration of power in a handful of companies? Well, everything indicates that in fact, this is true. For at least 90 years, the largest companies have been steadily increasing their size and market share. Specifically, only the top 0.1% of the companies that sell the most account for almost 90% of all company sales. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. The theory of concentration seems undeniable, and it is something that has actually been corroborated by a multitude of statistical studies all around the world. Studies that, by the way, we'll link for you in the description. So be that as it may, the question is this: does all this mean that we are heading for an apocalyptic world dominated by big business? Are we already there? Will the terrible consequences described in Lenin's book come to pass? What is the real reason behind corporate concentration? Today on Visualeconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. So let's get cracking. Let's see. In spite of Lenin or Marx's theories, and in spite of the fear that big companies will condemn us to poverty, the truth is that the world's largest companies are located in countries that are either very rich or have become very wealthy in recent decades. In fact, the economic success of the United States is often attributed to its super companies, to giants such as Apple, Microsoft, and Coca-Cola, corporations that generate a lot of jobs and increase the overall wealth of the country, in theory. At first glance, it does not seem so clear that having larger and larger companies is really bad news for the economy. Quite the contrary, in fact. Having large companies is something that seems to go hand in hand with a well-functioning economy. Now then, wouldn't it be better to have more small companies rather than large companies with a large market in order to avoid an abuse of power? Well, although having small companies may encourage competition and new ideas, having larger companies also brings many advantages to any economy. For example, larger companies have a greater capacity to adopt new and better technologies and therefore to contribute to the country's innovation. There are basically three main reasons for this. The first reason is that larger companies can take much better advantage of technology. For example, Amazon, which is a huge company that sells a lot of stuff, can get much more out of its website than a simple neighborhood store that sells to very few customers. The second reason is that large companies can more easily attract better qualified professionals who are also more innovative and are able to work with the latest technologies. And finally, the third reason is that large companies also tend to have more financial resources to invest in expensive and innovative technologies that, logically, a small company would find it difficult to finance. In short, large companies have a greater ability to become more technologically advanced and to push the overall economy forward. But watch out, because that's not all. Large companies have even more advantages beyond technological adaptation. For example, if a small company develops a super novel product, being a small company, it will have a lot of difficulties producing it, selling it, doing the right marketing, and making money with it. However, if the same product is developed by Apple or Microsoft, say, as they are true giants, they will be able to extract profits much more efficiently and quickly than the small company. You know, the old story, economies of scale. Well, in that sense alone, since large companies tend to have a lot of different customers, one thing they can do is to create a lot of different product lines, tailored for specific groups within their own clientele. So not only can they sell more, but they can segment their customers much better and therefore get more money out of them. A funny example of this is Nestle's brand of coffee makers, Nespresso. If you go to their website, you will find an endless list of possibilities. Vertuo, Original, Pro, Premium, Plus C, Plus D, Limited Edition, Platinum. You get the idea. Well, this extensive range of coffee makers allows them not to only adjust to each customer's, maximizing the possibilities of sales, but even to sell several coffee makers to the same customer who likes variety. This is what is known as economies of scale. scope, and it is ultimately part of the same story we've been telling you so far. Because of their size, their greater resources, and their sheer volume of customers, large companies can develop products, ideas, and technologies that small companies simply cannot. As you can imagine, this is good for the economy and for all of us. As consumers, we enjoy these advantages, the multitude of products, and the adaptation to our very specific tastes. But not only that, as workers or investors, the higher productivity that this allows companies translates into higher wages and profits. Hence, large corporations pay better salaries on average. However, does all this mean that there is no problem in having bigger and more powerful companies? Were none of the things that Lenin has said right? Well, wait just a second, because things are not so simple, and evidently, not everything is good news in this story. So why? Well, pay close attention to this graph. What you are seeing right now is how the size of the largest US companies have evolved versus the rate of entry of new competitors. As large companies have become bigger and bigger and bigger, the number of new competitors entering the market has plummeted. In a way, it is almost as if large corporations were preventing the creation of new and small businesses, as if they were cutting off new entrepreneurs. But let's take it one step at a time here. What exactly could be the reasons behind all this? Are the big companies conspiring to prevent their potential competitors from growing? Well, the reasons behind this phenomenon are diverse, and not all of them are conspiratorial. But in general, we could group them into three main causes. The first is that in the past, when there were no such large companies, it was quite normal for all of them to learn from each other. When one company found a technique to be more productive, the rest could copy that technique and adapt either in the same sector or in other sectors. The point is that when one company improved, those improvements spilled over to the other companies, and they all generally improved at similar rates. And you might ask then, what exactly did this process consist of? How could an improvement in one company spill over to all the others? Well, for instance, with workers changing companies and taking knowledge with them, transferring it from one company to the next. The other option for productivity spillovers could be cooperation between several similar companies or from different countries. Or even, these spillovers could occur through large corporate events and trade shows where ideas and innovations could be shared. So, what's the problem then? The problem is that over time, large companies have become so big that they are now increasingly distant from other companies. It is very unlikely to run into the owner of Facebook at an event with small entrepreneurs sharing ideas, or to see Google workers leaving their jobs to go to small companies where they can contribute their knowledge. So large companies are getting more and more isolated, and therefore have less productivity spillover to small companies. You could say that small companies can no longer take advantage of the productivity spillover to learn and adapt. Be that as it may, and leaving spillover behind, the second reason why large companies have less and less competition is that they can promote and exploit poorly designed political and legal regulations. That's poorly designed for all of us and perfectly designed for them, you understand. For example, in the US there is a law called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. This law, theoretically, serves to protect the environment, and to this end, forces many companies to pass tough environmental tests on many of their projects. The problem is that the tests are very, very slow, and they are also very costly, and companies that have to comply with them often face losses in the millions just to comply with this law. Well, it turns out that there is one group of companies that is excluded from conducting these examinations. Can you possibly guess what companies we might be talking about? In case you haven't, it's the companies in the oil sector.
BP lobbied Trump to weaken climate safeguards on new oil and gas projects. Together with the American Petroleum Institute, BP pressed for the climate impacts of major projects to largely be excluded from environmental assessments.
Because oil companies have a lot of power, who would have guessed, they can lobby the government and have managed to get around the tough NEPA tests. As you can imagine, this kind of gives them a huge advantage over other competing companies in the energy field, and even more so over smaller companies that do not have as much money as they do. Pretty brazen, right? In any case, beyond NEPA, there is still a third reason that explains how the development of large companies can dampen the entry of new competitors. Here, we are talking about the abuse of their dominant position. This abuse consists of the fact that large companies, through their market power, can make things difficult for small companies. But they wouldn't do that, surely. But just in case they might, let's see if we can find an example. Here's the example of patents. In recent years, larger companies have begun to file far more patents than smaller companies. In fact, small companies have reduced their patent volume at a diametrically opposite rate. It's as if the large companies are stealing patents from the small ones. So let's just say it is true that patenting more is not a sign of abuse per se. The real problem is that according to several studies that we'll link for you in the description below, the patents of large companies are increasingly of poorer quality, and everything indicates that they are being used strategically. In other words, large companies no longer only patent after making a discovery or developing a novel invention, but increasingly, a patent is to prevent a smaller company from adapting to their technology. They use patents strategically to block competition. This is something that can be seen, for instance, with the sudden increase in self-citing patents in recent years. These self-citing patents do not refer to new inventions, but are to something like a recycling of earlier inventions with different nuances. Basically, these patents can be used to block all kinds of loopholes that could be exploited by small companies to adopt cutting-edge technologies. Be that as it may, and in view of this, we now have to ask ourselves the most important question of all. What are the consequences of this increase in business concentration and the drop in the entry of competitors into the market? Is it really a problem that should concern us? Well, theoretically, a greater concentration of power in some firms could cause prices to be much higher than they would be in situations of perfect competition. In that case, corporate profits would skyrocket at the expense of consumer welfare. So the question is, has that happened? Have profits soared after the increase in corporate concentration? Well, the answer is that it depends on how you measure profit margins. For example, if we measure profits as a percentage difference between companies' revenues and costs, what we see is that profit margins have been shrinking over the last 80 years. In fact, the margin of the large companies have been shrinking closer to that of smaller companies. In other words, if we measure profits in this way, large companies are not only not posing a problem, but rather the opposite. They are contributing to lower prices. Now, how do you explain that? Why are companies earning lower profit margins than before if they are now much larger and more powerful? Well, one possible explanation is that they have changed the way they make money. When the companies that were smaller and had fewer customers, they needed higher profit margins. They sold few products because they reached fewer customers, but in turn, they made a lot of money on each sale. However, now, as companies are much larger and reach a much wider audience, they can reduce margins in exchange for selling a lot more quantity, which ultimately makes them more money. In any case, as we have said, this is only one way of measuring profit margins. As it turns out, there are another way of calculating them that gives us a very different result. This way consists of calculating the profit margin on the marginal cost, not the total cost. And what is the marginal cost, you might ask yourself? Well, it is basically the cost that a company faces when producing an extra unit of its product. But to make things simpler, this means that if the price of a product is well above marginal cost, the company that produced it can lower that price and increase production without having to lose money in doing so. In other words, the company could produce more and more cheaply. Well, if we look at profit margins using marginal cost, we see that they have skyrocketed since the 1980s. Who would have guessed? According to this graph, today's companies could lower prices by, wait for this, 60 percentage points without losing money on production. However, some nuances must be added to this calculation method. It is possible that the increase in profit margin calculated by the second method is influenced by reasons other than business concentration. On one hand, because margins have only gone up since the 1980s, and yet, as we saw at the beginning of this video, corporate concentration is a phenomenon that has been going on for as long as there have been records. At the same time, a perhaps more reasonable reason, which would better explain the increase in margins since the 1980s, could be the change in the production structure. You see, starting in the 1980s with the creation of sectors like IT and tourism, the services market began to take off like a rocket. And it is precisely this market that has had the highest profit margins of all of them. In other words, the higher margins calculated with the second method would be due to the fact that we are consuming more and more services, and not to the fact that the companies themselves are larger. And let's see, in a way, the fact of consuming more services, and above all having improved economically since the 1980s, has meant that in the richer countries, as people earn more money, than before, they now pay less attention to prices, which in theory would be allowing companies to increase their margins more comfortably. Basically, if people pay less attention to prices because they are richer, companies increase their profits even more. Now then, beyond the two calculation methods and their nuances, what conclusion can we draw from all this? Well, if one thing is clear, it is that the creation of larger companies has increased productivity, has contributed to improving our standard of living, and has reduced margins and prices across the board. But at the same time, large companies have made it more difficult for new competitors, and thanks to the calculation of marginal costs, we know that they could reduce prices more than they do. But don't hold your breath. So, taking this into account, we could say that the emergence of large companies has not been, at least for now, so negative for the economy. But at the same time, it could have been more beneficial than it has been. All in all, the results could change in the future. The economy is never static, so precisely for this reason, we would now like to ask you all some questions. Do you think that the productive benefits of large companies outweigh all the problems that we have explained? Do you think that the concentration of companies could be a more serious problem in the future? Do you think that we should be careful about all the abuses of power that we mentioned, such as in the oil sector? You can leave me your answer in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every single week. So hit the subscribe button and hit the little bell down there too, so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, please do like it so we all know. Take care, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.